Most people believe Marie Antoinette's story ended at the guillotine. But by the time the blade fell, the worst part was already over. Long before her execution, revolutionary France made a different decision, not just to remove a queen, but to break a woman, to strip her of her children, to erase her dignity, to turn her trial into public humiliation rather than justice. Locked inside a prison cell under constant surveillance, isolated from her family, and accused of crimes designed to destroy her reputation, Marie Antoinette endured a slow and deliberate psychological ordeal, one meant to end her long before her life did. This is not the story of how she died. This is the story of what they did to her before the guillotine, and why many historians believe it was worse than death itself. After the fall of the French monarchy in August 1792, Marie Antoinette was no longer viewed as a political prisoner awaiting a lawful decision. She was treated as an unresolved threat. The revolution had dismantled the throne, but it had not eliminated what she symbolized. As long as she lived, she represented continuity with the past, and in a revolutionary climate driven by fear and suspicion, symbols carried enormous power. The new revolutionary government was deeply unstable. France was at war with foreign powers, the economy was collapsing, and internal divisions were growing more violent by the day. Leaders of the revolution needed a visible enemy to unify the population against. Marie Antoinette, foreign-born and already unpopular, became the perfect target. She could not be allowed to exist as a figure of sympathy or dignity. The decision was not merely to execute her, but to dismantle her influence first. This strategy had been forming long before her arrest. For years, pamphlets known as libels had flooded Paris. These publications portrayed Marie Antoinette as immoral, corrupt, sexually deviant, and disloyal to France. Many were obscene. Most were false, but they were effective. They shaped public perception in a society where literacy was growing and scandal sold faster than truth. By the time the monarchy fell, much of the population believed they already knew who she was. When revolutionary authorities took custody of Marie Antoinette, they inherited this poisoned narrative. Rather than challenge it, they embraced it. To allow her dignity would have contradicted years of propaganda. To allow privacy would have suggested she deserved respect. Neither option was acceptable. The revolution required her humiliation to feel justified. She was arrested not as a suspect to be judged, but as a criminal awaiting confirmation. There was no presumption of innocence. There was no effort to protect her mental or physical well-being. Instead, she was deliberately reduced, step by step, from a recognizable human being into an abstract enemy of the people. One of the first acts of dehumanization was the removal of her name. She was no longer referred to as Queen, Majesty, or even Marie Antoinette. Official documents labeled her the widow Capet. This was not bureaucratic convenience. It was symbolic violence. The name severed her from royalty, erased her identity, and permanently tied her existence to her husband's execution. It reminded her and the public that the revolution had already claimed one life and would not hesitate to claim another. Surveillance became constant. Guards were placed close enough to observe her at all times. She was never truly alone. Conversations were overheard. Movements were tracked. Even moments of grief or exhaustion occurred under watchful eyes. This was not simply about preventing escape. It was about control. Total observation removes the last refuge of the human mind: privacy. Revolutionary leaders understood the power of psychological pressure. They believed that if Marie Antoinette could maintain composure, she might still command sympathy. And sympathy was dangerous. Sympathy could turn her into a martyr. So they denied her opportunities to display strength. Requests were delayed or refused. Familiar attendants were dismissed. Comforts were removed gradually, making each loss feel personal. The process was deliberate. Nothing about her treatment was rushed. Time itself became a weapon. The revolution needed months to prepare the public for what was coming. Each day she remained imprisoned, allowed newspapers to repeat accusations. Each week allowed rumors to harden into perceived truth. Each month allowed her isolation to deepen. Outside her cell, the revolutionary press intensified its attacks. Newspapers accused her of treason, financial corruption, and secret communication with foreign enemies. Evidence was rarely provided. It was not necessary. In a climate of fear, repetition mattered more than proof. The longer she remained silent behind prison walls, the easier it was to speak for her. Marie Antoinette was being punished without trial. This marked a profound shift in revolutionary justice. The legal system no longer existed to determine guilt. It existed to confirm decisions already made for political reasons. The trial, when it eventually came, would serve as theater. The real judgment had already occurred in the court of public opinion. Physically, the strain began to show. Years of stress, compounded by imprisonment, isolation, and grief, weakened her health. She had already lost her husband. She had lost her position. She was losing her children one by one. But even under this pressure, she did not give her captors what they wanted. She did not collapse publicly. She did not plead for mercy. She did not lash out. This restraint frustrated revolutionary authorities. They expected visible despair. They expected breakdown. Instead, they were met with silence and composure. That composure threatened their narrative. A broken woman would have justified their actions. A dignified one complicated them. As a result, the pressure increased. Surveillance tightened, isolation deepened. The strategy shifted from humiliation to something more intimate. Revolutionary leaders understood that political identity could be stripped away, but maternal identity was harder to erase. If they wanted to destroy her completely, they would have to strike there. Because in revolutionary France, even motherhood could be turned into a political tool. And that decision would mark the beginning of Marie Antoinette's most devastating ordeal yet. What revolutionary leaders understood was simple but cruel. Breaking a queen required politics, propaganda, and time. But breaking a woman required something far more personal. They knew Marie Antoinette could endure humiliation. They knew she could survive isolation. But there was one bond she could not protect through silence or composure. And so the revolution made its next move, not against the former Queen of France, but against her child. The moment revolutionary authorities decided to take Marie Antoinette's son from her was not sudden, and it was not impulsive. It was the result of weeks of observation, discussion, and calculation. By the summer of 1793, the revolution had already stripped her of status, freedom, and dignity. Yet despite everything, one thing remained beyond their control: her role as a mother. Marie Antoinette's son, Louis Charles, was 8 years old. To royalists, he was still the Dauphin, the symbolic heir to the French throne. To revolutionaries, he was something far more dangerous. As long as he remained close to his mother, he represented continuity, loyalty, and the emotional core of the royal family. Separating them was not just a security measure, it was a political act. On July 3, 1793, guards entered the Temple prison with orders that could not be refused. Marie Antoinette was informed that her son was to be removed from her care. No explanation was offered that she could challenge. No legal process protected her. This was authority acting without appeal. Witnesses later described her reaction as immediate and desperate. She resisted. She pleaded. She physically attempted to prevent the guards from taking him. This was not the reaction of a queen defending power. It was the reaction of a mother confronted with irreversible loss. But resistance was futile. Revolutionary orders were absolute. Her son was taken from her arms and placed under the control of revolutionary custodians. From that moment forward, Marie Antoinette would never see him again. The separation served multiple purposes. First, it isolated Marie Antoinette completely. Her daughter was already removed from her daily care. With her son gone, the last emotional anchor in her life was severed. Isolation intensified, grief deepened. Uncertainty became constant. Second, the revolution gained control of the child himself. Louis Charles was placed in harsh conditions and subjected to revolutionary re-education. He was surrounded by adults who spoke against his parents, against royalty, and against the past. He was encouraged to reject his family identity and adopt a new one shaped by revolutionary ideology. But the most disturbing purpose of his removal was still to come. Revolutionary authorities understood that children could be manipulated in ways adults could not. Louis Charles was young, frightened, isolated, and vulnerable. Under constant pressure, his words could be shaped, redirected, and ultimately used. The revolution did not need truth from him, it needed statements that could be weaponized. Marie Antoinette, locked away and denied information, had no way of knowing what was happening to her son. This uncertainty was part of the punishment. Each day passed without news. Each night brought fear. She did not know where he was kept. She did not know how he was treated. She did not know if he was safe. Psychologically, this was devastating. The human mind seeks closure. The revolution denied her that. Grief without answers becomes something heavier, something that lingers, something that erodes strength over time. Revolutionary officials justified the separation publicly by claiming it was necessary for the child's well-being. Privately, they understood its strategic value. A broken mother was easier to control. A terrified child was easier to manipulate. Together, they could be used to construct a narrative that justified everything the revolution planned to do next. The removal of her son marked a turning point. Before this moment, Marie Antoinette was a political prisoner. After it, she became a subject of psychological warfare. The revolution no longer focused solely on what she had allegedly done. It focused on what could be forced out of those she loved. This act also sent a message to the public. If the revolution could take a child from his mother without consequence, it demonstrated absolute power. No bond was sacred. No relationship was protected. Loyalty to the revolution replaced loyalty to family. For Marie Antoinette, time slowed. Days blended together. The absence of her son filled every thought. She replayed the moment of his removal repeatedly, searching for something she could have done differently, but there was nothing. The decision had already been made long before the guards arrived. The cruelty of this act was not only in the separation itself, but in its purpose. The revolution did not remove her son simply to isolate her, it removed him to prepare him, to reshape him, and ultimately to use him against her when the time was right. Because when the trial came, it would not be enough to accuse Marie Antoinette of political crimes. The revolution needed accusations that shocked, silenced, and destroyed sympathy completely. And for that, they needed her child. With her son gone and her family dismantled, Marie Antoinette was left entirely alone. What followed was not relief, but a new stage of punishment, one defined by constant observation, physical discomfort, and deliberate humiliation. This is where her imprisonment became something far more calculated. With her son taken and her family dismantled, Marie Antoinette entered a new phase of captivity. This was no longer simply imprisonment. It was containment designed to wear her down slowly. Revolutionary authorities now had what they wanted: total control over her environment, her body, and her remaining sense of self. At first, Marie Antoinette was held in the Temple prison, a medieval fortress repurposed as a revolutionary detention site. Its thick walls and narrow spaces were meant to isolate, not rehabilitate. Inside, time lost meaning. Days were governed by guards, not clocks. Silence was broken only by footsteps, commands, and the sounds of other prisoners being moved or questioned. Her living conditions were intentionally stripped of comfort. Furniture was minimal, light was limited. The air was often cold and damp. These conditions were not extreme enough to provoke outrage, but they were harsh enough to erode physical and mental strength over time. This balance was deliberate. Revolutionary leaders did not want her to die quietly in a cell. They wanted her alive, visible, and diminished. Surveillance was constant. Guards were positioned close enough to observe her movements at nearly all hours. Privacy, even in the most basic sense, no longer existed. She could not change clothes, rest, or grieve without being watched. This level of observation was not primarily about preventing escape, it was about control. Continuous surveillance removes the final refuge of the human mind, the ability to be alone with one's thoughts. Even sleep offered little relief. Night watches ensured she was never entirely unwatched. The sense of being constantly observed creates psychological strain that builds slowly but relentlessly. Over time, it alters behavior, posture, and speech. The individual begins to regulate themselves out of fear, even when no command is spoken. Marie Antoinette was also subjected to deliberate humiliation. Guards addressed her without respect. Her former titles were forbidden. She was corrected if she spoke too formally or with perceived pride. Every interaction reinforced the same message. She was no longer a queen, no longer special, no longer deserving of dignity. These actions were not random cruelty by individual guards. They reflected official policy. Revolutionary authorities believed dignity itself was dangerous. If Marie Antoinette appeared composed, calm, or graceful, she could still inspire sympathy. And sympathy threatened the revolution's narrative. Her clothing was plain and increasingly worn. Requests for replacements or repairs were often delayed or denied. Small personal items disappeared over time. Each loss was minor in isolation, but together they formed a pattern. Identity was being erased through accumulation. Meals were basic and inconsistent. Sometimes food arrived late. Sometimes it was insufficient. Hunger dulls concentration and weakens resistance. The revolution understood this well. Physical discomfort amplified emotional vulnerability. Communication was tightly restricted. Letters were censored or withheld. News from outside arrived only when authorities allowed it. Marie Antoinette was cut off from the world beyond her cell, left to imagine events rather than witness them. This uncertainty magnified fear. The mind fills silence with worst possibilities. After her transfer to the conciergerie in August 1793, conditions worsened. The conciergerie was not a long-term prison. It was a holding facility for those awaiting trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Prisoners there were known as the antechamber of death. The atmosphere was oppressive, cells were smaller. Noise was constant. The presence of other condemned prisoners created a sense of inevitability. Marie Antoinette's new cell was narrow and exposed. Unlike the temple, she was now under almost uninterrupted observation. Guards were stationed within sight at all times. Even basic bodily privacy was denied. This was intentional degradation, not negligence. Despite this, there were moments of quiet humanity. A few attendants, such as Rosalie Lamorlière, later described Marie Antoinette as restrained, polite, and deeply subdued. She spoke little. She conserved energy. These small observations frustrated revolutionary expectations. She was not collapsing publicly. She was enduring. That endurance, however, came at a cost. Her health declined. Years of stress, grief, and confinement weakened her body. She suffered from exhaustion and illness, yet medical care was minimal. Treatment was delayed. Revolutionary authorities had little incentive to improve her condition. The humiliation extended beyond physical space. Marie Antoinette was aware that her image was being attacked daily in the press. Newspapers and pamphlets continued to publish accusations, caricatures, and rumors. She could not respond. She could not defend herself. Silence became another form of punishment. This imbalance was intentional. The revolution controlled the narrative while denying her a voice. Each day she remained imprisoned allowed the public version of her to grow more monstrous. By the time she would stand trial, many citizens would believe they already knew the truth. The purpose of these conditions was not simply to punish. It was to prepare. Revolutionary leaders wanted a defendant who appeared weakened, isolated, and stripped of authority. A woman whose dignity had been chipped away long before she entered the courtroom, because the trial was never meant to be fair. It was meant to confirm what the public had already been taught to believe. And as Marie Antoinette endured humiliation behind locked doors and watchful eyes, the stage was being set for the final performance, the trial that would judge not her actions, but her existence. That performance was about to begin. By the time Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal in October 1793, the trial no longer functioned as a search for truth. Its purpose had already shifted. The courtroom was not a place where evidence would be weighed or doubt explored. It was a place where a political conclusion would be performed in the language of law. The Revolutionary Tribunal itself was a creation of fear. Established during the most unstable phase of the French Revolution, it existed to process enemies quickly and publicly. Its structure reflected its purpose. Trials were short. Verdicts were decisive, acquittals were rare. The appearance of justice mattered more than justice itself. In revolutionary France, law had become a tool of survival for those in power. Leaders feared foreign invasion, internal rebellion, and the collapse of authority. To maintain control, they needed visible enemies, and once an enemy was named, the legal system existed to confirm that designation, not to challenge it. Marie Antoinette was the most symbolic enemy imaginable. Her trial officially began on October 14, 1793. The timing was deliberate. Nearly a year had passed since the fall of the monarchy. Her husband had already been executed. The Republic had hardened. The public had been prepared. The delay allowed propaganda to do its work, shaping opinion until guilt felt self-evident. By the time she entered the courtroom, Marie Antoinette was no longer a person in the public imagination. She was a character, a villain constructed through years of rumor, caricature, and repetition. The trial did not introduce this image, it relied on it. She was brought in under heavy guard, not as a former head of state but as a spectacle. Her physical appearance shocked many observers. Once known for elegance, she now appeared visibly worn. Her hair had turned white, her face was drawn. Months of isolation, stress, and illness had left their mark. This transformation served the prosecution's purpose. It visually reinforced the narrative of guilt and decay. A weakened defendant appears less credible. A diminished figure is easier to condemn. The charges read aloud in court were broad and expansive. She was accused of treason, of conspiring with foreign powers, of draining France's finances, and of attempting to undermine the revolution from within. These accusations were sweeping, vague, and difficult to disprove precisely because they lacked clear evidence. That vagueness was intentional. The prosecution relied heavily on association rather than documentation. Letters were interpreted rather than verified. Intent was assumed rather than demonstrated. Past actions were reframed to fit present political needs. In this environment, proof became secondary to narrative. Much of the case drew directly from libels, the scandal pamphlets that had circulated for years before the revolution turned violent. These publications had once been dismissed as obscene rumor, now they were treated as moral testimony. This marked a critical shift. Political propaganda had crossed into legal authority. Satire became evidence. Accusation became fact through repetition. Marie Antoinette's ability to defend herself was severely restricted. She was assigned legal counsel only days before the trial began. Her attorneys were given almost no access to documents. They were not allowed sufficient time to prepare a meaningful defense. Witnesses were selected exclusively by the prosecution. Cross-examination was limited. Objections were overruled quickly. The structure of the proceedings ensured imbalance from the start. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was openly hostile. Spectators filled the gallery, encouraged to react, comment, and judge. This was not discouraged, it was part of the design. The revolution wanted the people present, not as observers but as participants. The trial functioned as public theater. Laughter erupted during testimony. Interruptions were common, emotional reactions were amplified. The presence of the crowd ensured that proceedings remained performative rather than reflective. At several points, accusations shifted away from political crimes entirely and moved toward personal degradation. These moments were calculated to shock. They were intended to silence empathy rather than establish truth. When these allegations were introduced, even some in the audience expressed discomfort. But discomfort was not the goal. Disbelief was not the goal. The goal was paralysis. The prosecution needed claims so severe that defense itself became impossible, not because rebuttal could not exist, but because the subject matter overwhelmed reason. Marie Antoinette's response during these moments was restrained and measured. She did not raise her voice. She did not collapse into visible despair. When she spoke, it was briefly, clearly, and without theatrical emotion. This refusal to perform frustrated her accusers. In the logic of the revolutionary tribunal, emotional control was interpreted as guilt. Calmness suggested arrogance. Silence suggested concealment. Any attempt to maintain dignity was framed as defiance. The trial moved at a relentless pace. Testimony blurred together. Deliberation was minimal. There was no pause for reflection. The outcome advanced as if guided by momentum rather than judgment. On October 16, 1793, after only 2 days of proceedings, the verdict was delivered. Marie Antoinette was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. The speed of the decision confirmed what had been evident from the beginning. The trial had never been designed to evaluate evidence. It existed to formalize a political decision already made. The courtroom served as a final justification, not a forum for justice. For Marie Antoinette, the verdict marked the collapse of any remaining illusion. The legal system had revealed its purpose fully. There would be no appeal, no reconsideration, no mercy. Yet even after the sentence was pronounced, the punishment did not end. The revolution was not finished with her mind. What followed was a brief but intense period of psychological reckoning, hours in which the weight of imprisonment, isolation, loss, and public condemnation converged. There were no speeches then, no crowds, no performance, only silence. And in that silence, the final chapter of her suffering began, one that unfolded not before judges or spectators, but within the narrow space between sentence and death. That final ordeal would define how history remembered her. After the Revolutionary Tribunal delivered its verdict on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was led back to her cell in the conciergerie. The legal process was complete. The sentence had been pronounced, yet death did not come immediately. Instead, she was returned to confinement, forced to wait with full awareness of what lay ahead. This pause between judgment and execution was not mercy. It was intentional. Revolutionary authorities understood that the mind could suffer far longer than the body, and they designed this final stage accordingly. The waiting period stripped away the last illusion of uncertainty. There would be no appeal, no political reversal, no public intervention. The revolution had decided. Marie Antoinette now possessed complete knowledge of her fate, and she was required to live with that knowledge alone. Time slowed dramatically. Each hour became heavier than the last, not because of what was happening, but because of what was coming and could not be stopped. Her cell was small, dim, and constantly monitored. Guards remained nearby at all times, ensuring she was never truly alone, yet never allowed meaningful human connection. Even now, at the very end, privacy was denied. The revolution did not want her to retreat inward without supervision. Silence itself became oppressive. The sound of footsteps outside her door, the shifting of guards, and the distant noises of the prison all reinforced her captivity. Psychologically, this environment was devastating. The human mind seeks distraction when faced with fear, but none was available. There were no letters arriving, no visitors, no comforting routines. Sleep came only in fragments. Thoughts returned repeatedly to the same unavoidable conclusion. The revolution had removed uncertainty not to bring peace, but to enforce inevitability. Marie Antoinette had endured months of calculated degradation before this moment. She had been stripped of her title, her name, her family, and her dignity. She had been observed constantly, accused publicly, and humiliated privately. By the time she returned to her cell after the verdict, there was nothing new the revolution needed to do. The damage had already been done. Yet even in this state she was not completely silenced. She was permitted one final act of agency, the writing of a letter. This letter, addressed to her sister-in-law, was not a political document. It was personal. It spoke of forgiveness, faith, and love for her children. She did not use it to defend herself. She did not attack her enemies. She did not attempt to shape history. That choice was significant. In her final hours, she refused to play the role assigned to her by the revolution. They wanted defiance or collapse. They wanted drama. Instead, they received restraint. The letter revealed a woman who had already accepted what could not be changed and chose to focus on what remained within her control. Her physical condition reflected the psychological toll she had endured. Months of stress, illness, poor nutrition, and emotional trauma had weakened her body. She was visibly exhausted. Yet witnesses later noted her composure. She conserved energy. She spoke little. Every movement appeared deliberate, as if she understood that control over herself was the last thing that could not be taken. The revolution had attempted to reduce Marie Antoinette to a symbol of corruption, excess, and betrayal. When that was not enough, it recast her as a criminal. When that still left room for sympathy, it sought to humiliate her as a woman and as a mother. Each transformation was designed to strip away layers of identity until nothing recognizable remained. This is where the true psychological punishment becomes visible. The revolution did not rely on a single act of cruelty. It relied on accumulation. Each humiliation built upon the last. Each loss reinforced the next. By the time execution approached, Marie Antoinette had already been dismantled piece by piece. When guards finally came to escort her from the cell, there was no resistance, no plea, no protest. She rose and followed their instructions. Observers later remarked on her calm demeanor, often mistaking it for resignation. In reality, it was exhaustion shaped into discipline. There was nothing left to fight, as she understood it. Her final journey through Paris was designed as a public display. Unlike her husband, who had been transported in a closed carriage, Marie Antoinette was placed in an open cart. This decision was symbolic. The revolution wanted visibility. It wanted confirmation. It wanted the population to witness her reduced state and internalize the message of revolutionary power. As the cart moved through the streets, crowds gathered. Reactions varied. Some shouted. Some watched silently. Some simply stared. The revolution expected humiliation to complete the narrative. Instead, the moment revealed something more complex. Marie Antoinette did not engage with the crowd. She did not seek sympathy or react to hostility. She looked forward, detached from the spectacle surrounding her. This refusal to perform was important. The revolution depended on emotional participation to validate its authority. Her silence denied them that satisfaction. Even now, she would not become what they wanted her to be. By the time she reached the scaffold, the psychological ordeal had already reached its conclusion. The execution itself was brief. The suffering that mattered had occurred long before. What remained was not fear, but finality. Historians often focus on the moment of execution, but that focus misses the larger reality. Death ended her pain. What preceded it extended and intensified it. The months of isolation, the separation from her children, the constant surveillance, the public accusations, and the deliberate humiliation formed a sustained campaign of psychological destruction. This is why many historians argue that what was done to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine was worse than death itself. Death is instantaneous. Psychological punishment unfolds slowly. It erodes identity, hope, and meaning over time. The revolution succeeded in executing Marie Antoinette, but it did not fully control her narrative. Her final composure contradicted the image they had spent years constructing. Instead of a monster or a villain, witnesses saw a human being who endured extraordinary psychological pressure without surrendering entirely to it. In that endurance lies the reason her story continues to resonate. Not because she was flawless, not because she was innocent of every accusation, but because her final months reveal how power operates when it seeks not only to eliminate an enemy, but to erase their humanity first. Marie Antoinette's death closed a chapter of the French Revolution, but her psychological punishment remains a warning. It shows how easily justice can be transformed into spectacle, and how cruelty can be justified when wrapped in ideology. This was not simply the execution of a queen. It was the systematic dismantling of a person. And that is why history remembers not just how Marie Antoinette died, but what was done to her before she was allowed to die. Because the guillotine ended her life, the revolution had already tried to end everything else.